Hello.
Hello. Can
I
you
might
hear me?
not have audio.
Hello. How are
Hello. How are you?
Hey, doing good.
Good. Good.
Feels like you passed torch to me. I remember the days when you were the one with issues with your audios and stuff. Now it's me.
I think I may also have this time because I didn't hear that whole like warning your voice or this meeting or whatever is being recorded.
Oh.
So maybe we both had audio issues.
Yeah, good to be not alone. Shortag is out. Let me ping Rita if she's joining or not.
Sure.
Let's do it on this. Okay. So, hey Max, I remember you saying that there might be some other folks working on Gatekeeper in future from Google. Like,
Hmm.
is there any plan for somebody new to join Gatekeeper anytime soon? Do you know?
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have enough context yet to give you good details.
No, because I did see like couple of PRs from some of the folks, and I was wondering if they are gonna join or not. But then I didn't hear anything anymore. So yeah,
Yeah, that it would be good. Just need to sort stuff out
yeah.
before I know uh, how everything will actually be arranged.
Cool. Rita says she'll be late few minutes. So
Just waking up still, recovering from I was sick and I took one of those. I think it's NyQuil tablets, and I think it's made me extremely groggy.
uh, I hope you are feeling better now.
Thank you. Mostly the grogginess, though. Probably should have just like tried without medication.
NyQuil is like one of those medications that just makes me sleep all day or all night. Whenever I take it, I just need to sleep. It's like,
What is that? Is that the antihistamine in it? That's like, is it just super powerful or something?
yeah, I don't remember the composition, but it's something that just makes me really drowsy.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
Hello.
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 Hi. No camera today.
I mean, I'm not gonna turn it on if no one else is turning it on.
Hey, someone's got to start.
I consider it a kindness to the world. Although you did miss, my dog was coming down the stairs and my cat got into like crouch mode, wiggle butt, trying to like, you know, I don't know if she's gonna like pounce on the dog because she's like 75 pounds, but it was very cute. You're very fierce. How are you?
I'm good. Just still recovering from a nasty cough, so I might try to mute myself to spare you the pain.
Oh, you and I both, eh?
Must be that San Francisco air.
Are we to address you by your formal title again this morning?
What?
It's the Sagat lead for your nameplate.
Yeah, I need to. I don't know when I logged in as that. Weird.
That's okay.
All right, what's on the agenda today?
Yeah, so let me just give you a little more context. We discussed this last weekend as well. One of the team member from Ratify raised this issue on paper, asking for some additional context or metadata to be passed along with mutation request in external data. So what their use case is that they want to provide different tags for the images based on namespace. So they're asking if something like that can be passed along in mutation requests so that they can provide different tag names for images based on the namespace data as well. So we were discussing like how do we achieve that, what's kind of work it would involve, uh, and what would the design look like. So yeah, in doing so, we kind of came up with three main questions. One is how it would affect caching for mutation, or for external
Not
data.
how it would affect caching, the fact
Yeah,
that
it would, but how
is the
would we
problem.
get
Yeah.
around, or how would we need to change the implementation for caching to accommodate this feature or request. Another one was that like how would we provide this additional metadata as a part of request, like where do we make the change. Um, uh, and the third one was that, I mean, do we want to just have the uh, do we want to just provide additional string, or like do we want to have more a complex structure on passing additional context? I think that was the third point of discussion, like just string or the whole object, or more
Uh,
structured information instead of string.
I I don't think that last one was a topic. I could tell you like whole object is straight out just because the idempotency requirements, right? Like part of the reason why we locked down to just providing string was with mutation, right? And there's two reasons for this for mutation, right? One is yes, the convergence, but two is that mutation is very latency sensitive, right? Because every call is one after the other. And so if you are calling multiple webhooks in serial for mutation, your risk of uh, hitting timeouts is very, very high, right? Particularly since usually mutation is called more than once, right? And so that leads us to one is an idempotence requirement, which basically, once you go through the mutation webhook cache query once, if you put it through again, you get the same answer. That's just grabbed straight from K8s best practices, but also that means that if you have a cache, then you're guaranteed to get a cache hit on the second try, right? So you limit the amount of mutation that comes up. So having access to the whole object, right, basically means that the whole object state is up for grabs in terms of uh, at least for mutation referential data, um, informing the decision, right? Which goes against all of this, right? Because like then to like there's other mutations that can basically invalidate your cache for you, leading you to multiple calls. So it would be more that putting static data in as context should be fine, right? Like namespace, maybe annotations, maybe labels, like those we treat kind of weirdly, right? We allow you to set labels, but we do not allow you to re
The existing one.
change the label value. But it's worth thinking about their like for annotations and labels whether they could be used. That's not in this ask, but it's I see it as a natural extension.
But if we go down that road, we still would require to pass more than just one string, like array of string or something like that. That's what.
Right, yeah. So we do have a problem with what is the cache key.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say, like if we use annotations, for instance, and if actually annotations are a very good one because Kubernetes thinks of the annotation value as opaque, is my understanding, like at the API level, right? It's just a string. It has no insight into as far as its contents. However, lots of people use annotation values as like JSON. They use JSON objects, for instance, as an annotation value. And the thing about those is the field values are unordered, right? Like if you have key value A equals cat, key value Z equals dog, right? And you serialize it that way. And then you have a separate annotation with key value Z equals dog, key value A equals cat, right? Those are the same object, even though they are not the same string, if that makes sense. So that would make me shy away from particularly annotations, right? Because again, we don't have any insight into the structure of those, so it might be hard to write an appropriate cache hit/miss mechanism there. I think the other thing we were talking about though was like we were using TTL for the cache.
So
And good.
Yeah, so we talked about two possible ways to modify cache. One is like composite key or hashing to use for key for the information that we pass. And the another one was request based caching, where we just clear out cache once the mutation request is done.
Yeah. And this is because Rita, unless we include this is coming back to me now, unless we include all the ancillary data in the cache key, then you can wind up with bleeding across caches, right? Like if you have two different objects in different namespaces, or sorry, two objects. Let's say you have two pods with the same name in different namespaces. There we go. Then you might leak information across the two namespaces, right? If your external data webhook is using namespace as a relevant bit of information for like setting a pod label or something, right? So your two options are either to make sure that the cache key includes this excess data, or you need to make sure that the cache only is lived enough for a single request, right? Because we're assuming we have constant data per object, right? And the request is object scoped. So if your cache is tied to the life of the request, then key values as they are currently defined, remain constant and useful for caching that way.
Can you remind me, because it's been a while, what we're using as a cache key right now?
So we just call it a key field, and we let the external data provider kind of define what they mean by key fields. So for I think a common one would be image name, right? And we use just the full image string as a cache key. And then the provider, presumably strips it of irrelevant information or canonicalizes it and then sends back a response.
Sure, but the concern you have around like the same cache key being used for different namespaces could happen today, right? Even, yeah.
Right. The difference is that because in today's world, because the external data provider doesn't have any namespace context, right? It was never going to return a different answer anyway, right? So either as an external data user, you're like okay with that situation of regardless of what namespace you live in, for a given key, you're getting back a given answer, or you're not, and you don't use external data. For now let's assume this new world where we give the namespace as additional context, right? And let's say we're dealing with something where we're like giving back, I don't know, owner data, right? These are the people on this team or whatever. If if you're using namespace as like a relevant qualifier for which team you should be looking at, right? And let's say you got two teams in different namespaces. They're both into experimenting. They're using foo for their name, right? The first team tries to create a pod named foo, and based off the pod name, we're determining its purpose, right? And so it reaches out to external data and it mutates, saying like,
right.
hey,
So from that perspective, it sounds like we should include namespace.
well,
it should be a namespace
sorry,
aware.
let me finish why this is risky, right?
Okay.
So that team one, let's call it, created a pod named foo in team one's namespace. They're going to get team one back as an owner. Now, for our caching, right, because we're only indexing based off of pod name, let's say, team two, if they make a request, right, in team two's namespace, because team one just performed their action, they're going to get a cache hit and they're actually going to get team one results, right? Because it's not going to even bother reaching out to the external data provider.
And that's, yeah.
Yeah. And so that's where, having a cache and not having the keys be scoped well enough, or not having the cache lifetime be scoped well enough, leads to data leakage.
Yep.
Okay.
So from that perspective, we should make sure the cache key is namespace aware, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's two options. Either yes, the cache key takes into account all potential extra relevant data, or the cache is unique per request, right? Like it gets wiped after every request, or we run completely separate copies of caches, right? Because then
But then you're kind of defeating the purpose of the cache.
Somewhat. You still get deduplication of outbound requests per inbound request. And arguably you get a more aggressive cache expiry, which, might help prevent stale results. But that does come at the cost of more frequent cache misses. And potentially, if you're dealing with something that is multi-threaded, like validate all of our webhooks, actually, if your solution for expiring the cache, when you can have like overlapping lifespans, is actually to have multiple caches, then you have excess memory use. You can like maybe start to like squint and come up with other mechanisms, kind of like reference counting for keys in a cache. Like, oh, this request was interested in this key and it's still alive. But arguably, that could lead to like very, very stale data unless you do that carefully, because you could basically chain requests, and if you do that over a course of a year, as long as you keep your requests overlapping, you can read data that was cached from a year ago, unless it also has a TTL. So yeah.
But per request caching would also help with the same way for conversion, right? Like right now, multiple mutation request goes through external data for conversions purpose, right?
So right now, the thing that helps with convergence is caching is kind of unrelated to that, right? We've said that for a given input, the output must have a stable result, and also that if you take that output and feed it back into the system, you return it's like a no-op. You get back what you put in. I think caching makes the effect that caching has, actually, it might mask times when users do not maintain that invariant, right? Because the cache already makes this assumption, right? It's saying, oh, this is the same thing. I'm going to just spit you back the key again. And if the external data provider actually wasn't going to do that, right, then the cache will have like papered over that. And you can imagine this with, let's say you have something that converts Docker image tags to hashes, and someone has decided in their repo to like retag images, right? They're using the latest tag, let's say. It's very possible that your first lookup with the latest tag will give you one hash, and then your second lookup with the latest tag will give you a different hash. Actually, that, come to think of it, that doesn't break idempotence, right? Because at that point, once you've done your first lookup, you have a hash, and hashes cannot get retagged. But it does kind of break this predictability thing, though, of within the same request, latest always means the same thing. So convergence actually is fine, but at least for that one. But what do they call predictability? Sorry. There's a name for it. I use it sometimes, but I'm too groggy to come up with it. Basically, stable input yields stable output. Anyone remember the name for that? It's a common programming name. Determinism. There we are.
But then, so that means that the cache implementation that we have right now is only useful when there is subsequent requests for different namespaces, right? Like, let's say if I'm doing mutation only one time, So what my question is basically, per mutation we hit the cache or external data just once, right?
Mhm.
Like for each mutation request. Okay, cool.
That's the intent, and you would still get that if all of your metadata is constant at the request granularity. There is, I think, something you hit on where you are much more likely to have cache misses, right? Like in a world, like going back to my two teams creating a pod named Foo example, in a world where we don't have namespaces metadata, uh, those two teams would be a cache hit, right? For the second team. And so you'd have overall lower average request latency for if pod or sorry if namespace was factored into the cache key, then necessarily you have two cache misses rather than a cache miss and a cache hit. So you will have doubled your average latency. You will have not doubled your peak latency, right? Presumably, your peak would remain relatively constant. The QPS to the to the external data provider would double. However, the external data provider, it could have its own caching. So to the extent that it's like looking at some data store that is more latency sensitive, the provider itself could maybe do some isolation there, right? Like if it doesn't use the namespace, it knows that, right? And so it can maintain its own cache. I think in general, though, it's hard to give like a specific impact that this would have on like cache hits, misses, and what that would do to overall traffic. Like it would depend on the spread of requests, right? How often is the cache like hit? Uh, in this previous reality, right, of only having the one key field going into the cache key. And
So
also, what is the relative like request volume, right? Are all is it all in a single namespace? If so, then nothing would change. Uh, do you have like 50,000 different namespaces, right? And everyone's only doing this once every like day. At that point, you may as well have just not had a cache.
so yeah, what I'm trying to understand is, if we hit multiple if we per mutation request, if we hit the cache multiple times, then it makes sense to have like request like mutations TTL, or sorry, cache expiry per request, right? Like if you are hitting the cache only once per request, then there is no point of uh, implementing that mechanism, and we should consider a composite key or a hash key, right?
Well, I don't know if that's relevant to that particular concern, right? Like the cache key versus TTL. For my mind, the cache key versus TTL argument basically comes down to memory, right? Because I personally, I think that if you wanted to tie the life of a cache to a request, your first implementation of that is going to be separate cache per request, right? Because dealing with reference counting and TTLing of the reference counting, like I'm seeing at least 1,000 lines of code there, probably more. None of it very simple. And also the risk of TTLs. Well, I mean, I guess TTLs could always expire mid-request. But yeah, there's just a lot of code complexity that you're going to introduce relative to having a more complex caching key, right? Where the main complexity there is just to make sure that the caching key is stably derived, such that, you know, semantically identical requests get cache hits, whereas semantically different requests do not. And yeah,
Yeah, that
then
that was one more concern, right? Like if we do request like cache expiry per request, even though if somebody is trying to create, let's say, 10 pods in the same namespace, they would need to, like, the cache would expire for each mutation. So even though the external data would have resulted in the same, we are missing on cache and potentially uh, like getting more latency.
yeah, so the cache provides less of a buffer uh, against QPS to the external data source at that point. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, like, I don't know if this cache is really intended to protect the external data provider so much as it is intended to reduce latency to the K8s API server. Those are not unrelated concepts, right? Like if you laser down the external data provider, you're going to increase your latency. Um, yeah, you are right. That is an effect. I don't know how seriously to take that concern. I would be more concerned about memory if with high request volumes, because then like if you're maintaining a separate cache per request and you have 1,000 simultaneous requests, you're using 1,000 more cache RAM times more cache RAM than you would.
I'm sorry I cut you off. You were like
Oh,
intending to say.
oh yeah, no, I was just gonna say that, yeah, so in order to avoid code complexity, what you would need is separate caches, which is where you get this like multiplication of RAM usage. That was that was the full circle.
So sounds like we are going towards having a composite or a hash key after
If
we
we
decide
want
to pass in.
to, like if we want to do the you know, extra contextual data stuff, like and to be clear, I'm not like there's nothing here that's obviously one way or another to me in terms of that. Like I don't know what the use cases are or how common they would be. The thing that I would like though is to like know the impact of what supporting it would have, right? Which is, you know, one thing we know now is the caching. There would be some API design around like the external data provider request response, more so the request than the response. Um, and also know then what that means as far as a principled stance for us going forward, right? Why I looked at annotations then, even though it's not part of this request, is I could see that being a natural follow-on here, right? But because annotations are this necessarily like opaque thing, right? That not everyone uses in the same way. Um, Annotations themselves uh, might be a very bad idea to use as a cache key because they almost guarantee a cache miss, let's say. Um, and so knowing that that is a concern, right? we should come into that with our eyes wide open, right? Because that may be a request we're going to need to deny in the future. The other side of this, oh right, is so there's the impact on us from implementing more complex caching logic. But then there's also the impact to the user, right? Like any kind of increased specificity of the cache key raises the chance of there being cache misses, which, as you point out, increases the load on the external data service, also increases the amount of REST requests, latency, all that. So what about users who don't care, right? They'll be negatively affected by this cache key unless, I think you mentioned this last week, we have the ability to let providers specify which cache keys are relevant to them. Which extra contextual data is relevant to them. Or maybe consumers of providers, or maybe both, right? But if we get into that, then that's more complexity, right? We need to figure out who is interested in specifying. Is it the external data provider? Is it the consumer of the external data? And is it both? And how do they provide it? And if it's both, how do those two map on each other? Yeah, so we just need to think through that stuff before saying yes. That's my thought.
For, I mean, it looks to me it should be on whoever writes mutation policies rather than like whoever implements external data, because that's how you opt in, I guess, right? Like if
So
something
good.
if something changes on external data, we shouldn't be affecting the existing mutation policy, right? I mean, the ones that are created already, that, let's say, external data introduces a new mechanism, saying this namespace is now requirement of, or it could be passed as an additional context, right? But
I don't think this falls into the realm of breaking backwards compatibility, because in theory the cache is transparent, right? Like the cache is uh, a mechanism by which the API is delivered rather than part of the API itself. It is true that you get different timings of responses back, right? Which can affect, what was a previously a viable deployment shape may no longer be viable after a change like this. But the workloads running on top of that deployment wouldn't see a change. You just need to like rescale, which I'm not saying it's not a concern, but I don't think it's a backwards compatibility concern. The as far as putting it in the hands only of the writers of external data, I think there's some problems there in terms of, one, are they positioned to know what the downstream consumer cares about as far as like its lookups, right? Like, will image paths be mutated differently based off of namespace? Almost certainly no, for 90% of the cases at least, right? Because Docker repos, unless you have like a different Docker repo per namespace, like an image is an image is an image, right? If you're pulling from the same like image pool, then you're going to get the same kind of translations. So, in the vein of not impacting users, right? If you're using an external data provider that doesn't take this stuff into account, why should users be aware, right, that this is happening? If you put it entirely on users, then we get into the validation issue, right? Because validation, you could call external data using Rego, right? So where is it specified, right? Is it specified as part of the external data registration object that we have? If so, then what happens in Rego if we provide that extra context? Or is it that a Rego interface doesn't provide room for that extra context and we just like provide it or not under the hood, which I actually probably makes more sense, to be honest. Rego is a weird case in the sense that it's a lot more free form how external data providers can be queried, and we know less about how they will be used. So it's harder to make generalizations than it is with, say, mutation around like, oh, this is clearly like a good thing, this is clearly a bad thing. But yeah, I would be tempted to say for Rego, you can still only provide the one key, and we'll provide extra context or not at a platform level, and that would leave our options open with regard to sending extra context. But is there a but here?
That would
Good.
that would mean modification in constraint as well, right? To for providing uh, additional context in external data functions for validation.
No, no. So if the extra context is provided implicitly at the platform level, then either there is no extra config needed, right? Or the extra config happens at the provider registration level, right? Once you get down to the constraint template level, you're already underneath that like provider level, right? So you wouldn't get that. However, what that does mean is then you've affected which personas have access to this config, right? Maybe external data providers, which makes sense to me because external data providers, again, ultimately are the ones looking stuff up, so they know what's relevant. And then if we do it at the platform level, then it's just whatever admin is controlling gatekeeper's footprint, right? Because presumably you're not going to let all users create providers willy-nilly. Right. And so you've kind of cut constraint template and constraint authors off from being able to customize how the feature is used. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, right? Like my intuition, not having like ran the scenarios of where might this be useful, where might it not be, is that that's the right balance. If you wanted to make this thing customizable at all, particularly because I'm leery of having arbitrarily injectable extra context in Rego, just because like once we cross that line, there's no going back, right? And we don't know, like there's no way to statically analyze Rego to see how the external data providers are being called. So we will have basically precluded ourselves from any further work along these lines once we go that route, right? So we should know for sure that it's necessary before doing that.
So what's the decision here? I'm in multitasking, sorry. You said so are we doing composite hash keys? And if so, what are we exposing?
I think that presumes that we want to do the work, right? Which again, I'm neutral to, but would definitely like to summarize. I think yes, composite cache keys would be the right answer if we were to do the work, but that means then writing composite cache keys, right? That means then figuring out how we want to uh, deal with the reality that now there's like extra potential like keyable context. Like do we want to make it so that external data providers can say which cache context they care about, which they don't? Do consumers of Gatekeeper also want to have a say in that, so that if like 1% of users want to use namespace as a extra context and the other 99% don't, the other 99% don't have degraded performance because of the 1%, right? Because they'll have more cache misses, right? Because you're caching off namespace. In addition to whatever cache key. We also need to develop a principled stance, right? With the most obvious in my mind being annotations. Annotations are not cache keyable, right? So we would need to be prepared to like draw the line at least annotations as context. Maybe there's other contexts that are likely that we would need to draw the line on. And then once we have a full view of like the work that would be required, that informs like at least prioritization, right? And two, once we know the impact on the ecosystem as a whole, I think that's where the could versus should question comes in. And again, in my mind, there's nothing like clearly, oh, we shouldn't. But the amount of thought I've put into it is just like all the monologuing I've been doing during this meeting.
For 50 minutes.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, the issue that you linked, right? That I think they're only asking for namespace, right? They're not. I don't think they're asking for annotations. Okay.
No.
All right. I want to confirm.
But I mean, I think if we go with namespace, we should at least design for extensibility if somebody else asks for something different, right?
Understood. Yeah. And I think the concern is how do you control that? And how do you manage it so that it doesn't blow up and also like backward compatibility and all that?
Yeah, and just to have like some preformed principles around it, right?
Sure.
So that one, it's very clear what our answer is and we could give a well-reasoned response. And two, like if we realize, oh man, it's like impossible to like hold this ground, that would be an argument for just like not doing.
Sure.
Yeah.
I do think having providers specify what they want in the as a cache key makes sense. And yes, we could have some maybe validations to make sure certain like certain things are not possible to be used as a key, to be part of the key. But I think that if you give them that sort of that hook, then that's the extensibility that I think that's more scalable long term.
Yeah, and validations we probably don't need if it's like an enum, right? Like give me namespace and give me name, right? And I
But
don't know what
you
else.
mean we will come up with a enum, like a kind of like a loud list kind of thing?
Yeah, like here's the extra context you can
Sure,
request.
sure. And I guess you could extend by adding more stuff to the enum.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Just
Yeah, I
not.
think that's a good idea.
That's it.
As the list of allowed components.
Although because we're extending it, it's not an enum. Kate's backwards compatibility guides.
No. So if not an enum, then like
It's an enum. It's just a list of strings with a
yeah,
set of
it's a
buffer
list. It's a
values.
list, but it's an enum.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
I
List
mean slightly.
that works as an enum. If you want to be technical here. As the list of allow components to be used as a key to be specified by the provider. Right?
Mhm.
And this will allow for extensibility.
But then do users also get to cull that list? Right? Like,
What's the benefit of that?
well, because you're gonna the more data you put into the cache key, the more likely you'll get cache misses. Right? So if we have this image lookup, external data provider, I do think that greater than 90% of users do not care about any external context. They're just like the image path is the thing,
Well,
right?
I thought that's what we mean by having the provider make that decision. So as a provider, I will look at that enum list and I said I only care about the name. I don't care about the namespace.
Well,
And
let's
JDIP develops another external provider, let's say for something else, and that he cares about the namespace, and then he would use namespace as part of the composite key, right?
so let's put on the hat of I'm an image provider, right? Image
External data provider.
provider for images, yeah. And so I have one user that comes to me with a request of, hey, I'd actually like to look at a different Docker repo depending on what namespace the image is in. Now I'm faced with a dilemma. Like this is the only user I know of who's interested in that. If I implement their request, that means that now I'm asking Gatekeeper to send me namespace, but now I know that cache misses for all of my other users are gonna go up, right? So I'm basically there's now a competition, right? Who's more important, right? This one user not being able to do a thing at all, or these other users who were relying on that cache to, improve their performance. If users are able to also have a say in which context they send or do not, then those two interests are no longer competing with each other.
So
Right.
in this case, is the user the policy author?
The user would be the gatekeeper installer person, right? Whoever manages the fact that gatekeeper can reach out to that provider.
But
Right.
so then if
Okay, go ahead.
yeah, so my question was if we are allowing providers to define what kind of additional context to be provided, I think provider is also been create provider object is also created by gatekeeper admin, right? So
Yeah.
so we'd be creating two providers, one with the keys, one without the keys, using the same external data provider, and then users can like the policy authors can use whatever, right? Based on their need.
Right. Okay, but that then implies that whoever's configuring the provider object can configure the set of keys, which is cool. Like that works.
I thought the gatekeeper deployer is the one that sets up the provider, right?
It is, but you can, in terms of like what data gets sent out, there's different models, right? Gatekeeper could reach out to the provider directly and say, let me know what data you want, right? As part of like a bootstrapping or whatever. And that would be, simpler overall because users wouldn't need to worry about like details of how the provider behaves. On the other hand, they would have no say in which keys are or which data is relevant, right? So it's a salient.
Let's think about it a little bit more. Yeah, and also we're at time basically.
Yeah. I like what you guys are saying though. Like that makes sense to me.
Which one? The deployer?
Yeah, the fact that it's in the external data provider object and that you can have
Big,
multiple
right?
providers. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, as a provider, I just write the logic for setting up the connections, basically. But how the actual deployer of that provider wants to configure their key is up to the deployer, I think.
Yeah. Like we could try to break it some, not in -0 minutes, but are there edge cases? Probably.
I thought I thought you were saying like within the same cluster, there are like different policies where one cares about the namespace and others don't, which I can see, but that's too hard. I
Oh
think
yeah,
you,
and yeah, and
yeah,
that would be irrelevant for caching at that point, right? Because there it's just the weakest link in the chain. If
yes, that's
anything
right.
cache misses,
That's
they
right.
all cache miss.
That's right. That's right. That's why I was like, I think it's the cluster, the, the gatekeeper deployer, because ultimately they're the ones that's like basically have to figure out what is the lowest common denominator, basically. Yeah. Anyway, I captured the notes. Feel free to update. But hopefully that was helpful, Jay. And also I know I owe everybody like a lot of PR reviews. I'm sorry. But also, what's up with the DCO stuff? It's just none of it is working. And it's not just my stuff. I see it's not working for other people's PRs either. I don't
Has
know
it?
if it's yeah.
I have not been paying attention to the DCO stuff. Have people not been signing off?
No, it's the check, it's not running. It says it's required, but it says it's like I don't know that I don't remember the specific error,
Yeah,
but
it's just pending,
ending.
waiting to be
Yeah,
reported.
right.
That's yeah.
Well, you got to reach out to GitHub. They're
But I
they're
don't know if it's just our repo or everybody. I don't think it's everybody. So anyway, let's follow up on this, but it's basically blocking all the PRs. It's really annoying.
yeah. I mean, we could bypass that check,
Worst
right?
case is we turn it off for now, but obviously that's not a good long-term solution. So I just
Yeah.
didn't know maybe you guys already looked at it or no.
I also wouldn't turn it off. I would just like bypass it because that we still want things to be signed off, right? That's like a
Yeah.
CNCF
So
requirement.
I don't, so what do you mean by turn off then?
No, just
Just
What do you mean
manually
by
merge it right now, right?
like can't maintainers just like submit anyway?
I don't think so. I
Uh,
don't, I could be wrong.
like sometimes there's some checks you can like render optional, or I thought there's like a force submit.
No, we cannot merge.
Hmm.
When there's pending stuff, we can, I mean, that's the whole point of the setting, I guess. We could
Interesting.
temporarily disable that requirement, but
Because I've seen in the past that PRs with failed workflows have been merged. So I guess that's different than pending still. But like when we had errors in linting or somewhere, we did merge the PR as well because the action itself was faulty, not the linting was off for the PR.
Yeah. But we should investigate, I guess, before disabling.
all right.
Right.
Talk to you later. Bye.
Fight.